Climate Law Matters, a holistic way of considering transition and climate risk. Interview with Peter Carter. Hello, listener, and welcome back to our podcast, Climate Law Matters, in which we explore the legal developments across different sectors to address the key issue of climate change. I am Steph David, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers, specialising in environmental and climate change cases. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Peter Carter, Head of Climate Practice and Head of Captive and Insurance Management Solutions at WTW. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
First, Peter, can you tell a listener about WTW?
So WTW, or Willis Towers Watson, as it was formerly called, is a leading global advisory and insurance brokerage firm. It can trace its insurance broking history back to 1841, when Henry Willis applied for membership at Lloyd's. And then on the actuarial side, Reuben Watson founded Watson & Sons way back in 1878. So the firm has been around a long time. And today, WTW provides data-driven, insight-led solutions in the areas of people, risk, and capital. So in one sentence, you could say we help make our clients' organizations more resilient, motivate their workforces, and maximize their performance. But let's break that down a little bit so it's more relatable. On the people side, we provide advice on things like pay equity, pay transparency, executive compensation, retirement, and employee experience. And then on the risk side, we help clients identify and analyze their business risks. And then we act as an intermediary, finding the best solution to finance those risks. That might entail finding the best insurance solution or an alternative solution, such as weather derivatives or parametrics. And then finally, on the capital side, we advise insurance companies on capital allocation and pricing of the risks they underwrite when issuing insurance policies. And on the investment side, our investments team help institutional investors make smart decisions. And our clients there would be pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, government funds, wealth management companies, endowments, and charitable foundations.
Wow, it's certainly multifaceted. You could sum it up as building up resilience since 1841. What's your role and focus at WTW?
I am an MD in our risk and analytics business, which is part of the corporate risk and broking division on the insurance side. And I'm responsible for two business units that has clients all over the world. So the first business unit is Captives and Insurance Management Solutions. So here we help companies or commercial insurance companies set up an insurance entity, and we can help run those. Effectively, they are able to outsource their back office to us, and we'll take care of all the administration, the regulatory filings, and make recommendations about the appropriate solvency and capital reserves for the claims coming through. And then on the climate side, I look after a team where we use our knowledge of climate change and insurance and claims associated with insurance policies to help clients better understand how climate change and the transition to a lower carbon emitting economy will impact their business model going forward. And then armed with these insights, our clients can help then develop strategies to become more resilient.
And how did you end up at WTW?
Well, I was looking for a change of scene after 10 years in the banking industry. And a former boss that I was working for in banking introduced me to the team at Willis. I really like the people and the culture, and I've been here now for 9 years.
And so you mentioned on the climate side, the focus is the transition to a lower carbon economy and how the business model has to adapt. Why is there a need for someone with your focus at now?
Looking at some of the recent climate-related losses, such as the major hurricanes Helene and Milton in Florida, and the devastating flash floods in Valencia over the past couple of weeks, we clearly need to come up with creative solutions to match more capital to these types of risks and solve the insurance protection gap that these events highlight. In 2023 alone, there were over $100 billion of insured natural catastrophe losses globally. Global losses from natural catastrophes in the first half of 2024 amounted to 120 billion. So, already more than in 2023. And the insured losses making up about half of that figure, so 62 billion, So clearly there's a gap between the actual losses experienced and that's been covered by insurance. And turning to that Valencia incident, the estimated insured losses there will be around €1 billion and probably will rise farther as the loss adjusters get to assess the full extent of the damage. So going forward, I think you could probably say that for every 1 degree Celsius of global warming, you'll probably see a global GDP loss of around 12% for each degree of change. And that's quite a frightening number when you consider that we're probably heading toward a 3.2 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100 based on the current policies that we see globally and the current levels of activity to try to reduce global warming to a different number. So against this backdrop, I think it makes sense that we challenge our thinking. The traditional principle of insurance is that the premiums of the many help pay for the losses of the few. But what happens when the losses are many? And what happens when you get to a point where potentially you can't buy insurance anymore to protect your property against some of these natural hazards like flooding or hurricanes? So in this context, I think this is where you need to start thinking about how can you blend both public and private balance sheets together intelligently to make sure we've got the right capital in place to help businesses and communities rebuild after severe weather events and hopefully minimize the overall impact on the global economy as a result of events that I think, unfortunately, are going to become more frequent and more severe. So we need to build up some resilience behind that. We can't just rely on one solution, namely insurance.
Your focus so far has been on natural disasters and catastrophes, and we'll come back to that point shortly. But just going back to basics, I mean, what exactly is climate risk?
Simply put, climate risk is the thought that by continuing to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're putting more energy into the climate system, and that then translates into more severe weather patterns and events like the ones I've alluded to earlier. So climate change is a risk that is having an effect of amplifying many of the risks we have always had to deal with, like property damage from wind, hail, and flood, and losses from business interruption as key assets are temporarily knocked out of use after a severe weather event.
That's interesting in and of itself, isn't it? Because some people talk about a distinction between kind of transition risk and physical risk, whereas your definition of climate risk appears to have a slightly different angle.
I think it's key that we recognise the problem that you can split the climate risk further into, look, I've got a suite of physical assets that I rely on to generate the income and profits of my business. And clearly, if any one of those assets that's key to that business model is impacted by climate change, that's going to give me a severe interruption. And I need to think about how I can build better resilience on those physical assets now so that doesn't become an issue. And at least then I've bought myself a little bit of time to then consider, okay, as the whole economic system moves to a slightly different model of consuming and emitting less carbon, how does that impact me? How does that impact my supply chain? How does that impact my customers? And I think it's important to think about many different scenarios that could play out in that more dynamic future world. And I shouldn't get stuck on just one particular scenario, but I need to look at all the different channels that climate change and the transition to a lower carbon economy as a way of making climate change less impactful. How is that going to show up in the way my business model operates? And what contingent actions should I be thinking about and be ready to take as these different scenarios play through? And that's probably how I would think about climate change being multifaceted, and having lots of contingencies up your sleeve is probably the best way to mitigate against some of the risks that are out there.
So just picking up that point then, in headline terms, before we drill into the detail, how do you think firms should be approaching climate risk, resilience building, and their transition planning?
I've written about a 3-step process. So I think step one, let's make sure that you are thinking about and are on top of the risks to those income generating assets in your business. Make sure that that's not suddenly going to give you a bad headache and actually threaten the viability of your business over the coming years. And when you're secure on that basis that your business is viable because you aren't going to have a warehouse or a factory or an office that is completely inoperable for a long period of time, which could then damage your business. You can then move on to the next step, the second step, which is to think through how your business model is actually caught up in a wider economic system. So you need to kind of understand 360 across that system, how the transition to lower carbon will unfold and therefore indirectly impact you too. And then when you've tackled those two steps, you're in a really good position to think through what else is out there. So how is changing legislation or changing regulation going to impact me, and what can I do to get on top of that as well?
On that last stage, so in some of your writing, you've indicated the focus tends to be on the regulatory requirements, the reporting requirements. Do you think the regulatory mechanisms are an effective tool to deal with climate risks?
I think the regulatory system is an important nudge to help companies focus on the right things. But I do worry that it can lead to a less than strategic approach to compliance, if you will. So I do worry that if all you do is focus on the regulation, particularly around carbon disclosure, you might be focused on only a small part of the puzzle here and not really thinking through that more dynamic universe that I talked about in the transition risks, which is, okay, so how will the changes over the next 20 or 30 years as the economy becomes more electrified and moves away from consuming hydrocarbons to produce energy, how is that going to change my business model? So I think regulation is part of the story to nudge and guide the right actions, but I don't necessarily think it will lead to a wholesale reallocation of capital to completely solve all of the risks that we see associated with climate change. I think for that to happen, you've really got to get both government and the corporate sector thinking much more strategically and more systemically about what are the best projects to invest in now to assure the future, and actually have that properly analyzed in a business case that you can say, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense and it's worth investing in this, and let's move capital toward these projects that do make the best returns in the medium and long run versus projects that might be at face value attractive, but when you do the deeper inspection, don't really move the needle in terms of managing climate risk and accelerating the trend away from burning and consuming hydrocarbons.
On that point then, in terms of the strategic and systematic thinking, are you envisaging that from kind of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions as well as kind of adapting to climate risk?
Yes, absolutely. It's both. And I suppose a simple example here to illustrate, if you just focus on carbon emissions, you may miss some other aspects of the transition that in financial terms are quite overwhelming, right? So if you think of a software company that's perhaps advising the fossil fuel industry on technologies or techniques to optimize extraction of the natural resource, you might on the face of it think, well, a software company isn't emitting a significant amount of carbon. So the transition through to a lower carbon economy will gradually impact them over time. So, okay, that could be quite a severe financial impact for the software company. And that's a problem, isn't it? Well, conversely, you might have a miner that is extracting lithium. And overall, in terms of the financial impact that has in electrifying the economy, clearly that's a key natural resource that's going into battery production that's going to be important for the newer technologies to help manage the transition. But the actual process itself of extracting the lithium is, quite carbon emitting and quite carbon intensive. So there are some really complex trade-offs here that I think just focusing in on carbon emissions won't necessarily lead you to the right answers unless you start thinking about the whole complex economic system as a dynamic system, kind of all these different parts moving, hopefully in concert together, and not just sort of focusing on one small component, which we know has a big driver on overall climate change. But actually you miss the point of what are some of the strategic resources you need to gradually move yourself to a different and hopefully safer level of carbon emissions in the overall environment.
And how do you at WTW go about modelling those complex trade-offs that you describe?
2 or 3 techniques we use. So for a long time, we have been helping clients understand the losses associated with natural catastrophes. So we call that NatCat modelling. So that's looking at some of the more extreme, less frequent events, but can have some quite significant financial losses. So that's a skill set where we use our experience from the insurance industry and how claims in reality play through and the types of losses you see from certain events. That's certainly an important part of the information and data we use, but also working with experts to pressure test those traditional models used in insurance to work out what is an appropriate amount of capital to put behind these losses and how much to price this risk. We kind of need to also overlay the fact that historic data may not be a good indicator of the future, especially when it comes to the severity and frequency of weather events. So there we use our experts in the climate space to help overlay traditional forms of modeling exposures and frequencies with an understanding of how global warming is then going to have an impact on drought and heat and rainfall, so that we can then further refine those traditional forms of modeling to give, hopefully, improved answers on exactly what the risks are and the exposures and how to go about financing those risks in the best possible way.
How do these models account for tipping points?
That's a great question, because clearly at a tipping point, you get a very dramatic breakdown of what had been observable trends historically. So I think that's where you flip through to the more dynamic system modeling that I talked about, which is where we have developed a suite of models that look at commodity markets and how different industries are using different commodities to produce the products and services that they rely on for their economic model, to then have an interconnected view of the world where you can say, okay, well, if I shock this dynamic suite of models in a particular way to explore, so what happens then if I see a tipping point? Maybe it's the ice sheets in the Arctic and Antarctic dramatically melting and causing a significant rise in sea levels. What is that going to do then to the different commodity markets and therefore the different industry sectors? And then start to model out how we could see quite dramatic shifts in valuations of constituents of those different industries, whether it be the share price or whether it be the value of debt, whether any of these constituents have issues around their credit worthiness, because, quite simply, their business model might be so impacted they have a significantly different cash flow profile out into the future. It's not perfect by any means, but I think by having a suite of models that allow you to, if you will, perform thousands of different experiments or what ifs, at least it gives you a sense of where you might find a palatable solution or an answer, and that might be something that you want to strive toward very quickly if you're really worried that out there amongst all the different scenarios and what ifs, there are particularly challenging and toxic combinations of assumptions that you want to try and avoid. And I don't think you would know quite what they are or what tipping points to really get exercised about without that ability to somehow convert the narrative into a more quantitative and ultimately, financial impact, to understand the scale and the consequence, and therefore start to say, well, look, if that's the downside risk, how much am I prepared to invest now to make sure that doesn't become a reality?
I think for the listener, it'd be quite helpful if you can give maybe one or two more specific examples of how this might play out. I think the lithium mining one's a really good one, as is the software company example.
Gosh, I think that perhaps you'd think about, the example I gave earlier around a tipping point that could cause a dramatic shift in the sea level. I think then I would be interested in understanding, is my business somehow going to be severely impacted by that trend, that phenomenon. Maybe I have quite an extended supply chain. Maybe I'm a furniture manufacturer relying on wood sources from different parts of the globe, and I'm based in somewhere in the Midlands, and I need to obviously import that raw material. So rising sea levels could have a knock-on effect on the ports that I'm relying on to import that raw material. So I might need to consider, could that disrupt my cash flows out into the future in a way that I hadn't ever envisaged? I hadn't ever envisaged that maybe a port was so badly damaged by a storm surge that it was inoperable for 6 months. And I simply don't carry 6 months of wood stocks potentially. So I might then need to think through, well, does that mean I need to move my business to be nearer the sources of raw material? Do I need to change the raw material I'm using? So rather than relying on overseas sources, maybe I can look to find sustainable sources nearer to home. So it's that kind of dynamic that you're looking to capture through some of these models. And sometimes you do need to go into the specifics of, okay, so what is the business that's wrestling with these concerns? What industry is it in? What's it relying on in terms of raw materials? And therefore, could we see some events out into the future, or just a more severe trend of existing events having a material impact on its future? And therefore, what could it realistically do now to try to anticipate and get one step ahead of the game?
My understanding certainly is that WTW do kind of research briefings on different sectors that would assist clients with identifying specific risks to their business model.
That's correct, yes. So we have on the shelf, if you like, already over 500 industry sectors that we've analysed out and can therefore provide a qualitative assessment. And that's really important. It doesn't necessarily give you all the answers, though. You probably then would want to do a more customized piece of work to start to go into a little bit more details and actually start to quantify specifically those physical and transition impacts for purposes of helping you determine, do I need to change the level of capital expenditure I'm investing in the business now to ensure my future? And I think the other thing that perhaps can get overlooked is actually, are there adjacencies to my business model that, knowing a little bit more from this research and how different sectors are going to be impacted through the transition, are there opportunities that I could naturally move my business into and so capture full advantage from that? So maybe there's something in the electrification, lithium ore space, right, that you'd say that's a good area to get into, and I can naturally adapt my business model to go there. There are many others that will undoubtedly unfold as we see new and emerging technologies to help combat the challenge we face. You know, clearly those new and emerging technologies will need all sorts of facilitating services and support and further enhancements in technology to truly perfect them. So I think there's lots of upside as well. It's not all doom and gloom.
Certainly refreshing hearing some optimism about the opportunities rather than solely the risks. Just going back to your furniture manufacturer example, because I think it's a really interesting one when it comes to setting climate risk into its broader context, so other environmental risks. The most obvious one I'm thinking about is, deforestation and due diligence regulations around deforestation. How do you go about advising companies to address climate risk in the kind of broader context of other environmental risks?
I think there we would look to some of the techniques that have been practiced for many years in insurance, which is, what do you do if there is a broader context that you want to capture, and how do you make sense of that perhaps to you unfamiliar territory, but quickly get your arms around it and quickly make some recommendations? So that would typically involve designing a workshop where you would work with a client's own internal experts, and through the medium of a workshop, explore some of the broader issues. Maybe it's, okay, so my manufacturing processes, will have not only that carbon emitting component, but maybe there's a broader knock-on impact on the environment. So let's put all of our minds together through this workshop and consider, are we being good custodians of the broader environment, not just carbon emissions? And can we see some issues and risks emerging there? Maybe if you're in the furniture manufacturing arena, there is something you need to do involving forever chemicals to process and finish your product, which you might then say, well, I shouldn't perhaps be exposing the environment to those chemicals by just pouring them down the drain, I might need to think about how I safely dispose of those. And through the medium of a workshop, you can start to prioritize those risks into very high impact, medium impact, low impact. And you can start to explore a scaling of, well, are there some financial consequences of getting this part wrong? You can also consider issues around, well, what's the litigation risk? If I get this wrong and I'm sued, what's the damage to my overall reputation as a responsible and sustainable furniture manufacturer? And through that process, start to inform your enterprise risk management reporting framework or list of risks, and hopefully get a sense of the quantum. If I get this risk completely wrong, then this is the downside effect. And that's the genesis, I think, then for starting to explore in a more detailed way, well, is this something I want to be able to reliably revisit outside of the medium of a workshop with internal experts, maybe some expert consultancy help, or do I want something that I can actually have a little bit of a model that sits behind the risk that's been identified and be able to rerun it at different periods, maybe a couple of times a year or maybe quarterly, and just make sure that I'm updating the quantum of that risk as events change and assumptions change, and make sure that my CFO is aware of the risks I'm running here, because there might well be a business case to make sure that risk is completely eliminated from the manufacturing process, so it isn't ever an issue into the future. And again, that's all about allocating capital to the right activities that are going to have an impact. So they're just some of the practical steps you can take. Again, as I say, it's been used in the insurance industry for many years to try to get underneath the skin of some risks that are perhaps on the face of it or initially difficult to quantify if there isn't any established protocol or knowledge.
There's certainly a lot to think about. I mean, your 3 steps are helpful way through it all. But in terms of kind of summarizing and drawing together what you've said, what should companies be thinking about in sort of 1 or 2 sentences?
I would say, look, take early action and make sure that whatever you're contemplating here, you weave it into a strategic conversation. And the way you do that is to ask yourself, well, how might my competitors be thinking about some of these issues we've talked about, whether it be climate or impact on the environment more broadly? And if they take action and I take no action, does that somehow handicap me out into the future? And if so, how can I be a little bit more forward-looking and make sure that my competitive advantage stays on point? And then I think beyond the strategic conversation, absolutely you can think about, is there a way I can be more resilient in the face of some of these observable trends by making sure that my assets have been adapted to withstand the more extreme trends that I'm already seeing today? Maybe I could, with my other hat on, maybe I could think about setting up my own captive insurance company to flexibly provide insurance where the commercial markets seem to be reticent because the losses have been so severe. And therefore, again, make sure that I've always got an option to issue an insurance policy where the commercial markets may be very uncomfortable or uneasy about that. And then finally, back to that strategic conversation, I think practically think about, well, it's not all doom and gloom, is it? Are there some opportunities here that I could help my business capture and really accelerate my performance, notwithstanding some of these very significant challenges that we face?
Just one question on the back of that. What exactly is a captive insurance company?
This is a legal entity which has the requisite licenses to operate as an insurance company. So it is just like any other insurance company that you would turn to transfer the risks that you don't want to be fully self-financing. The only difference is that unlike an insurance company that is in the commercial space and therefore owned by shareholders, a captive insurance company has one owner, and that's the company that has decided to set one up. And you may say, well, why would you do this? So one of the reasons I gave earlier is to have greater degrees of freedom in terms of what risks you can cover and under what circumstances you can pay out, because basically it's your own vehicle. But also it's a mechanism for companies to access the reinsurance markets as opposed to the primary insurance markets. And you may say, well, why on earth would I want to do that? Well, one answer is that you can see some price arbitrage opportunities by looking at the pricing in different insurance companies, all to do with the horizon that those companies are working under. A commercial insurer typically has a shorter term horizon of 2 to 3 years, whereas a reinsurer is taking some really long-term views about risk and what capital to apply there. So there could be some opportunities to have differential pricing, and it's very hard to access reinsurance markets as a private company, even a public company, unless you're really big. Much easier if you're already an insurance company, because that's what reinsurers do. They reinsure the risk of insurance companies.
Do you think there's a need for more regulation or government-led initiatives?
I'm always a bit nervous about more regulation if it stymies creativity and innovation. So I think there's a danger that adding more regulation could have additional externalities that may move us away from a more optimum position in the overall global economy. So I'd be careful with that temptation. I think you do need to have good interaction between individuals being responsible and doing the right thing, because lots of individual consumers behaving in a positive way will have a significant impact in how they shape and influence what companies and service providers provide. I think you need a good, healthy nudge from public policy, but you also need entrepreneurs in the private sector to take risk and innovate. So I do think you need multiple stakeholders here. So I'd be wary about just relying on the stick, if you will, of regulation.
And that brings me then to the final question I have, which is a question I ask all my guests. What do you see as the greatest barrier or development? And that could be a legal barrier development or another barrier development, if you prefer, in addressing the key issue of climate change.
I think one of the challenges that I see for the legal profession, I would imagine, is the complexity and diversity of climate litigation. For example, who do you find fault with? Is it the government for not taking enough action in terms of regulation and public policy? Or is it the directors and officers of companies not doing enough to prepare their companies for what could be reasonably foreseen to happen with a little bit of modelling and a forward-looking view? And I suppose ultimately, haven't we all contributed in a way to the problem of climate change by virtue of being consumers and driving demand for activity that causes carbon emissions? I think in terms of developments, as I've said earlier, I think there's a wide range of regulations which requires firms to disclose their climate risk exposures and what they're doing to mitigate that and what opportunities they see. And I think that is having a real impact in driving progress in how we tackle this problem. So I think that is helping to ensure stakeholders across companies are engaged in positive actions to improve sustainability, reduce emissions, and more fully engage with the transition to a net zero operating footprint, not just for the benefit of the planet, but also to meet the needs of consumers like you and me and employees and shareholders and investors. And then I guess last but not least, in terms of the impact the legal landscape is having, I think we're seeing governments, fossil fuel firms and airlines increasingly receiving climate lawsuits. I think a recent article put the tally of the number of active cases at over 2,500 globally of such litigations. And that litigation in turn is gradually helping rewrite the public narrative on climate change, and in some cases resulting in a genuine shift in government and corporate policy. Whether or not the claimants win or lose, there's no question that there's real teeth as a result of litigation in terms of changing behaviours and the way companies and governments allocate capital to tackle the problem.
Thank you very much for your time, Peter. That was incredibly interesting.